All right. Good afternoon, USC. And welcome to the second event in our fall series of What Matters to Me and Why. I'm Vanessa Gomez-Brake, the Associate Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life here at USC. And truly, I welcome all of you, those of you who are on Zoom and Facebook, as well as those of you who are with us for lunch in the fishbowl. If some of you who are tuning in online want to grab a lunch, feel free to drop by. We have plenty of food later, and you can even come after the show, the main event, and grab a sandwich from Mendocino Farms. So before going any further, I'd like to acknowledge that November is Native American Heritage Month and that our beloved campus and city were built on the ancestral lands of the Tongva, Chumash, and Quiche peoples. So let us take this moment to pay our respects to their elders and ancestors, past, present, and future, who have stewarded this sacred land throughout the generations and even today. And let us honor their extraordinary traditions, identities, and stories. And just in case you didn't know, USC does have a Native American Student Assembly who I highly recommend you follow on Instagram. They're at USC NASA, not that NASA, but NASA, NASA. And also just support these student leaders and attend their programs. They welcome allies and so forth, and they'll be doing a lot this month and beyond. So just show them your love. So what matters to me and why? This speaker series represents a creative solution to an important problem in the university setting. It's that separation of the intellectual life from the personal and the spiritual. What matters to me and why offers the Trojan family an opportunity to hear from USC faculty and administrators in a very different way. Rather than lecturing on their area of expertise or research, we invite speakers to share their life journey with us. So once a month during this Wednesday lunch hour, we get to listen in as they reflect on the values, beliefs, and motivations that have shaped their lives. So if you would like to nominate a member of the USC community to speak at a future event, please do visit our website. That's orsl.usc.edu. And additionally, you can visit our website to view recordings of many of our past speakers, all really amazing Trojans and who are worth knowing. So before we get to our main program and our introductions, I'd like to highlight just a few upcoming events this semester. So I'm going to share my screen just so I can show you a few fun flyers, as well as introduce you to some of the folks in the audience there in the fishbowl. We're the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life. So what do? We provide care, and there is spiritual care available to all of you, whether you're a student, a staff member, or a faculty member. Here you see 6 of our folks who are available to you. Just schedule with us. We'll meet with you over the phone, over Zoom, or here at the Religious Center. And of course, we are confidential counselors. So anything you want to share with us in this space, we welcome you, and we will listen in and support you as needed. Next week, I want to highlight that our chaplain intern Annie, will be popping up on Truesdale to do some Dharma teaching. And what that means is truly a pop-up tea ceremony on the Parkway. And so come, we'll have Ferrero Rocher and some tea, and you'll get to learn a bit about mindfulness and how to go about your day in a mindful way. And perhaps you're catching on to a theme because we have all sorts of meditation opportunities, but a new one that's going to be offered by our other chaplain intern is our generosity meditation. We'll be doing a bit of a walking meditation there in Alumni Park on the eve of the next full moon, which is November 18th. And Venerable Sumanakiti, who is our Buddhist chaplain intern, he will be leading that meditation with a few other Buddhist monks at the center of campus. And so if you're curious about meditation and what it means to meditate on generosity, I invite you to join us out there for a mini meditation and connection with yourselves and with others. So that's just some of the fun stuff we have coming up for you for the rest of the month. But do sign up for our newsletter if you want to hear about everything else we're doing. And I hope to see you here in person or online as we do these various events. All right, that's it for my announcements. For those of you in the fishbowl, I will see you shortly. Please grab some food, sit back and relax. And also think about a question you may want to ask Professor Molina at the back end of the event, as we will make time for about 10 minutes of a Q&A. And I also welcome questions from our audience online, and you're welcome to chat those into your Zoom chat, and I will vocalize those for you. All right, so to introduce today's speaker, we have Judge Fusselman joining us to introduce Natalia Molina. This year, the judge was appointed by Governor Newsom as judge of the Los Angeles Superior Court. He is presently assigned to the Criminal Division. He's also a graduate of USC School of Law, 1998 to be specific, and he has worked as a litigation attorney for more than 20 years. He returned recently as an adjunct professor at the law school in 2019, and he's taught all sorts of courses, including torts, remedies, and pre-trial advocacy. So the judge first met Professor Molina in 1998 when she was working on her dissertation as a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan. And he helped with legal research on several of the immigration cases she discussed in her dissertation, as well as subsequent books and papers. So online and in person, please join me in welcoming Judge Fusselman to the room. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And you can hear and see me? Very good. Thank you for allowing me to introduce Dr. Molina. As you may already know, she is a distinguished professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC, where she teaches on issues of race, gender, immigration, and the history of racial formation. She's an award-winning author of 2 books, Fit to be Citizens and How Race is Made in America. And she has a new book coming out in 2022 entitled A Place at the Nayarit, that focuses on a restaurant founded by her grandmother and looks at how restaurants can serve as a cultural hub for immigrants. She also has dozens of peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and other publications, and she is a 2020 recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship. As noted, I met Natalia in 1998. She was still working on her dissertation, and I was a recent law school graduate, just a few weeks from taking the California bar exam. She often talked about the research that she was doing, and I offered to help, and she gladly accepted. And over the years, I've kind of become her go-to person for legal research. I will note that on many occasions, she just didn't want a legal opinion. She wanted to read the briefs that were filed by the attorneys, and sometimes even the transcripts from the hearings or trials. And this is just one example of Natalia's exhaustive research approach. Oftentimes, she'll spend a full day or even more tracking down details for an issue, not just in the law, but in all the research that she does. And oftentimes she knows that'll just end up as a footnote or possibly be cut out of a later draft. She does this just for a full understanding, so that even if the research doesn't get integrated into that project, her detailed note-taking and cataloging of those notes means she's able to draw connections, maybe not on that project, but in exploring other ideas and other projects, or even when working with other scholars on their work. And so in that way, much of her work is encyclopedic within her field. I know people too often rely on sports analogies in speeches, but since Natalia is a lifelong Dodger fan, I think it's okay to use one here. There is the concept of a 5-tool player in baseball, and that means someone who can hit for average, hit for power, someone who's a good fielder, has a strong throwing arm, and has good speed on the bases. And throughout history, there are just a handful of players that can be considered to be a true 5-tool player. In academia, when we're talking about faculty, we usually just refer to 3 categories, and that's research, teaching, and service. And with regard to research, we've already noted that Natalia is an award-winning author of 2 books, has a 3rd on the way, and is actually under contract for a 4th book. And that's not to mention an extensive number of articles and other writings. In terms of teaching, she has received a university-wide Distinguished Teaching Award and consistently receives glowing reviews from both undergraduate and graduate students. As for service, she has served as a chair or co-chair on countless committees, both within her own university as well as outside universities, and has also served on a number of boards, including the Organization of American Historians, California Humanities, and the American Quarterly. By any measure, Natalia's accomplishments in these three categories traditionally used for professors makes her a three-tool academic. But I would argue that there should be two more categories, and she's actually the equivalent of a five-tool player. I think there should be a category for simply being a kind person. And this quality in Natalia is exemplified by the fact that she has been able to form so many deep and enduring friendships over the entirety of her career, not just with those in her own cohort, but also with her own faculty advisors. When she was a graduate student, and she still works with her original faculty advisors, as well as with her own graduate students. And they are just sure to meet her for coffee or a meal whenever they are in town. If you've ever seen her at a conference or tried to see her, she's constantly booked from morning till night with coffees, breakfast, lunches, cocktails, dinners, and after dinner drinks. It's amazing to see the number of people that she has connected with and continues to connect with. The second category that I would argue makes up the five-tool academic is someone who cares. And to continue the analogy, Natalia hits this one out of the park. Natalia cares so deeply about the stories she tells, the stories that are often deeply personal for those that she's writing about, or even tragic. In addition to that, she cares about the education system, and not just higher education, but she also works on programming and pedagogy for K through 12 teachers. She cares about her colleagues, and not just about their careers and professional growth, but also their personal accomplishments as well as their struggles. And of course, she cares about her students. She genuinely wants them to succeed and uses any number of tools to support, encourage, and cajole and push. And when necessary, she pushes pretty damn hard to get them to their goals. On that note, I'd like to close with an example of an innovative approach used as a faculty advisor for a cohort of graduate students. She brought them to a place in the middle of the city where you could declare your intentions on a chalkboard. She brought her students to the space and asked them to publicly declare a goal relating to their dissertations. And while this might be kind of viewed as a somewhat simple exercise, it really did have a profound impact on their students. It was on a commonly traveled arterial street, and so the sign kind of presented a frequent reminder of their declarations, and so much so that the students regularly mentioned it. The sign ultimately represented a place where her students could return to celebrate their accomplishments. I'm sure Natalia has more to share about the idea of caring and why she cares. And so without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Molina. She's a five-tool professor and my wife.
Thank you. I invited you to give the introduction because we've been working together for, during the pandemic. We both had offices at home, not to make me cry. Thank you so much. Thank you also to the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life and to Associate Dean Gomez-Brake. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today very much because, as Judge Fusselman says, I really love my students. I really love the stories that I tell, and I love to seize any opportunity to talk about them. And so on that note, I'd say I'm going to give you three anecdotes, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. I was chatting with all the people in the audience online because I know many of them are my students, and I want to leave room for their questions. So the first thing is I believe in the power of stories, and I believe that I'll try to talk about this at different levels because I know there's professors in the audience, but also undergraduates and graduate students, as well as staff members who want to help our students. And so the first thing I'll say is I've always believed in the power of stories. When I was an undergraduate, I was having a hard time trying to decide what my major would be. And it's really common for undergraduates to switch, 2.5 times, switch their majors 2.5 times. I was also the first in my family to go to college, and I really felt like I needed to have a practical major. I needed to be like a business major or something. But it was really the humanities that called to me. And even then, I had trouble figuring out, which major to pick. But either way, no matter what I picked, the humanities offers a vehicle, whether it be through history, anthropology, literature, to connect with others. I really tried to get at that in my first book, Fit to be Citizens. And I think if you look at the book, it's an academic book, and it looks at how public health and race shape our understandings, public health and science shape our understandings of race in Los Angeles, from where health clinics are put and not put, from how redlining zones certain neighborhoods and sees them as worthy and unworthy, for policies towards immigrants that accept them at certain times and reject them at others. In lots of ways, public health and science shape our understandings of race. But honestly, when I started that book, I wasn't thinking like, how can I do an empirical study, a deep research study about race and Los Angeles to show this medical racialization. What I was really interested in was, why is it when I look at popular depictions of Los Angeles, from the newspapers to television shows to movies, why aren't Latinx people represented more? I mean, even as a small child, I would watch I Love Lucy. It was my favorite show. And there's an episode where they travel to Hollywood. And I remember thinking, I want to go to Hollywood. I've never been to Hollywood. I live like 5 miles from Hollywood. But that vision of Hollywood that really didn't include Latinx people, other ethnic racialized groups, workers, that really made labor invisible, wasn't part of that. And so for me, telling stories was always about trying to get at the stories of people not normally depicted. And again, because I know different people of different backgrounds are watching this and attending, and thank you for doing so. The first place that I started this was in my undergraduate career. So I trained with George Sanchez, who's now a full professor at USC in American Studies and Ethnicity. I'm very fortunate to work with him. I was his undergraduate when we were both still at UCLA. And I did my research on the construction of the East Los Angeles freeway. Why was it put in East Los Angeles? Why wasn't it put in Beverly Hills, which had also been planned at the time? And so I did research in the Edward Roybal archives, who was the first Mexican-American councilman in Los Angeles. And one of the things that I saw was these petitions put forth by his constituents in Boyle Heights. And they were written on these little pieces of paper, and people, it was like scraps of paper. It really showed, those material artifacts really showed the conditions of those that lived in East Los Angeles. Like, they had nothing to spare, right? That a little piece of paper, they wrote a petition saying, we love our neighborhood, your freeway is going to destroy our neighborhood, please don't put it here. And they signed it. And then when they ran out of room, people signed it all around the edges. Very different from the petitions from the Beverly Hills residents who had attorneys, private firms file their petitions for them. And so I thought, I'm going to go listen to their stories, right? I don't want to write a paper that doesn't reflect the stories of the community. And so I went to Boyle Heights. I had their addresses because they signed their names alongside their address. And I remember walking down the streets of Boyle Heights by the park, and then just getting to a part where the homes ran out. They buttressed against the freeways. And so, we saw that their efforts didn't succeed in not getting the freeway put in. They did succeed in, all these years later, 50, 60 years later, letting us know that they had a voice, that they pushed back, and they continue to inspire us today. telling these stories is not always easy. You know, one of the things that I learned when I was an undergraduate also is that certain knowledge is just simply appreciated more, given more respect. And so these stories of Latino immigrants that we rarely saw were not as valued. And even when I was an undergraduate, there was a professor who dissuaded Latino students from becoming professors who studied Latino communities, who studied Latin American studies. And I'm very proud that, you know, even as undergraduates, we pushed back on that narrative. A lot of us filed a petition then and complained about his remarks and said we had just as much right as anybody else to tell these stories. Nonetheless, in academia, there sometimes is there is a debate, less so now, but when I first started, about, you know, if you're part of a community, are you prone to be less subjective, more biased? It's this insider-outsider debate that one hears less about. And so part of that is why it took me till my third book, my fourth book, if you include my edited book, to tell the story of my grandmother's restaurant, the Nayarit, which was founded in 1951 in Echo Park. And part of why I wanted to tell that story, you know, one might think, oh, it's kind of a biography. I wish it was. Those narrative biographies are so well read, but I am someone who's interested in why these stories aren't always told, as a professor who understands urban studies, who understands Latino studies. And so I wanted to show why these stories aren't told. And I wanted to show what value a restaurant has as an urban anchor, as a cultural institution, as a vehicle for helping others to immigrate, as a way to do social networking. One of the ways that we've shown this before is through things like hometown associations, but those are often led by men, founded by men. And I wanted to show all the work that goes into building a neighborhood, building a community, providing a safe space. I also wanted to show that even though it's a it's privately owned, it's a semi-public space, and therefore should be treated as, you know, a space in which people can come together. You know, during this time period, places like parks, pools, even beaches were segregated. You know, there were ropes that went into the water at the beach, into the ocean, to segregate people of color from whites. And so people of color had very few places where they could actually come together. And so a restaurant takes on all the more meaning for this, all the more importance for this. The second thing I would say is I believe we can make things better if we see our common cause. So the point of doing Latino studies, critical race studies, is not to show racism existed and therefore we are on different sides of the dividing line. No, the point is to show that, you know, this is how ideas about race were embedded in our society. And if we show that it's not a natural construct, then we can also break these ideas down. If we show that those who fought for, you know, justice were not just people of color, but also whites, across religious lines, across ethnic lines, across gender lines, then we can also see our common cause. So for me, this is never about trying to like draw lines between communities. It's always about seeing that we've helped each other out historically, and we can do so. We have done so in the past, and we can do so in the future. One of the most human things one of the things that makes us human is this storytelling, right, that I just talked about. But it's storytelling because we want connection. We don't want those divisions naturally. We want to be able to connect. So what I try to do in my work is I think about race relationally. So in ethnic studies, historically, this field has evolved by thinking about Latino studies, African American studies, Native American studies, Asian American studies, for example. But I try to look at these groups in relation to one another. What did it mean to be Mexican in 1950, for example, when I talk about my grandmother's restaurant? And how was that affected by what it meant to be white, what it meant to be Asian, what it meant in the absence of other groups in Los Angeles, for example? All this shows how race is a social construction. What does it mean to be Mexican post 1965? Once we have an increase of other Latino groups come, and we don't really say Mexican anymore. We talk about Hispanics, which is the first one of the first kind of umbrella terms that the government created. And then people pushed back and talked about Latino. What does it mean to now push back and for some groups to talk about, let's talk about Latinx, because it includes more gender inclusiveness and seeing gender as a spectrum. So these are all terms that evolve, and they're all shaped by the other groups around them, not just by Latinos, and not just about Latinos' relationship to whites. And so in my book, my second book, How Race is Made in America, I look at this historically, and there's so many moments of racial ethnic solidarity. From, in Chicano studies, one of the biggest events we talk about are the Zoot Suit riots during World War II, in which Latinos, especially those dressed in zoot suits, were attacked by servicemen because they were seen as being unpatriotic. And this was in Los Angeles. And the ways in which there was a multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition of people that stood up for them, many of them white, many of them women, many of them Jewish, because even though Jews were considered legally white, were not always socially or culturally accepted. And so they understood that otherness. I'm proud to say that as a Unitarian Universalist, I end the book by talking about the way that Unitarians are also involved in helping immigrants and immigrant rights. I look at the visits of Unitarians to the camps in Arizona put up by Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and looking at the ways in which they see common cause with immigrants as well. The Unitarian Church has a long history of that, including the one in Los Angeles, who has, even 100 years ago, invited great speakers, great intellectual and community leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois. So I think there's lots of moments of solidarity that we can look at when we look at racial and ethnic studies, to look at the ways in which we have common cause. And then the last story that I'll tell you about is I believe in, I think people often talk about the phrase paying it forward. I believe in paying it forward. I believe in paying it back. I believe in paying it in any direction you want to talk about. One of my students just, I think on Tuesday, mentioned that she is doing a project that is studying how many Latinas are in education. And she was giving the class the numbers. And she was saying that only a small percentage of Latinas go on to get their master's degree. And I told them, it's even less so for PhDs. And then, as professors, when we get hired, we're assistant professors. If we get tenure, 6 years in, then we're associate professors. And then some of us go on to be full professors, which I am. And for Latinos that are full professors, there are like 1% of us that are full professors. And what I explained was, that this wasn't a way to, that I was trying to, I wanted them to laud me, or I was trying to show that I was like such a badass or something. But that these opportunities are very much shaped by these historical conditions that we've been talking about in our class, in terms of who has access to schools. We'd studied Mendez versus Westminster, in terms of what it means to have access or not access as the child of undocumented. We'd studied Plyler versus Doe. There's a legal reference for you, Judge Fusselman. We studied Proposition 187, and we looked at the ways in which education is denied to immigrants and the children of immigrants at times, if they don't have the proper paperwork. So, we've studied all this. And so I'm very grateful for organizations that recognize that there are these structural barriers and try to open up opportunities. Things like, the Ford Foundation, Mellon Foundation, things like, this event that just allows us to talk about how it's not just grit that gets us somewhere there, grit and intelligence and determination, but understanding structural barriers and how we might knock them down, basically. I will also say, and that there is some amount of grit that we need, right? Some belief in ourselves. And given we just had Dia de los Muertos, I'd be remiss not to figure out a way to bring in a story about my dear father who passed 5 years ago. When I was a graduate student, he told me, I told him I was going to take my qualifying exams, and he's like, or I was something, qualifying exams, or I was talking about my mentor and my qualifying exams. He said, what does a mentor do for you? Well, as a mentor for grad students, one, for the qualifying exams, you want to show that you have a understanding of all the literature in the fields that you study. But then once you write your dissertation and are working on your dissertation, you want to show that you can make an original contribution. And then once you go on the job market, hopefully when you go to conferences, they're helping you network. They're writing you letters of recommendation. And so they're supporting you in both your training, but also in getting what you do out there. And I remember my dad, who, had an 8th grade education, but was one of the best critical thinkers I've ever met. He said, Miha, you don't need a mentor, you need an agent. And it's a great point, because yes, in so many ways, we need an agent. We need to be able to talk about our own accomplishments. I'm always telling my students they need to talk, and former students, I still say students, but so many of my students are professors, even tenured professors. Why are we studying all this if we keep it like a little secret to ourselves? People think, oh, I don't want to be boastful, but we're studying race and structural inequality and how to make the world a better place. You have to talk about it. So we have to be our own agents. And this, I find examples of this like almost every day, honestly, almost every day that I interact with people. So just probably in the last week, I had a student who had taken my class, Pass No Pass. She is one of my best students, and she's a senior. So I said, why are you taking the class Pass No Pass? You're doing the work. You're a beautiful writer. You're smart. Yes, I just wanted to make sure, right? Like, we have to believe in ourselves. I met another undergraduate outside of USC who just knocked my socks off in his personality and how much he was able to balance work and studies. And I asked him what he was going to do after he graduated, and he talked about maybe getting a master's in education. And so, of course, I asked him to consider USC. We have a wonderful dean and wonderful students there who I've met. But I, asked him, students should always have choices. So asked him to consider different places. And afterwards, he told me, I never considered going anywhere but where I already was, right? Like, we have to dream big. We hosted my nephew's engagement party this weekend, and I met his future sister-in-law, who's still in high school, the little sister. And I said, I would be happy to read her college essay. And she gave me a hug, right? Like, of course I would. There is no point in any of us getting to where we are, whether it be attorneys, judges, professors, associate deans of, the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, any of these things, if we don't help others and just help them see their own beauty and what they can contribute. So with that, I'll stop and just say thank you for coming, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Adrian, Adam. Oh, I'm sorry, Dean.
Yeah, no worries. And can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, great. Well, I wanted to actually demonstrate this for those here who want to ask a question. If you could just come to the center aisle, and then we can take your question, and you can have a face-to-face conversation with Professor Molina. But thank you so much for that, and we will open it up to questions, and I think you're probably already seeing some in the chat box. So I'll invite you as you're ready, if you could for us, read the question in the chat and then provide your answer. But if it's all right, I wanted to go first. And one of the, this is partly comment, partly a question, is that you were talking about the important work of seeing what's going on at the borders, and even tying that to your Unitarian Universalist background and so forth. And so perhaps this is a plug, but every spring break, Reverend Jim Burklow, who is our Senior Associate Dean here, he takes about 20 USC students to the border in Arizona to engage with faith leaders who are providing support to those who are crossing the border, immigrants and so forth. And they plug in to see how you can put your faith and your values into action. And so that's something we really believe in. And that's something that we do here at the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life. And then perhaps my question for you is a bit more about maybe your own experience. You were sharing that the number of Latinx professors, especially in higher education, is at such a small number. And I was thinking, you know, I'm a Filipino American, and I just started the doctorate in educational leadership at Rossier. And this is the first time I've ever had a Filipina as a professor. And I can't tell you what that means to me. I didn't expect it, especially at this level. You know, I have 2 masters and so forth, but here I am finally doing the doctorate, and just to have someone who looks like me and has similar experiences as me and so forth that I can connect to in a different way. So I'm curious about your own history as you went through college and grad school and so forth. Was there a moment for you that sort of stood out that said, yes, this is what I want to do? Or like you heard your calling in some way that really tied to your identity as well? So that's my question.
My answer is not inspirational, but perhaps it will be a relief to many to find that. I had a very kind of serendipitous journey. So I, went to undergraduate. I think if people know me, they think I'm very organized and very much a planner. And I had a friend, just a very, very close friend, tell me this recently when we visited our former colleagues, but who we think about as our San Diego family in San Diego. I taught there for 17 years. And so I'm not someone who plans certain things. I just make sure the building blocks are in place. And so I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do as an undergraduate, but people said to go to office hours. So I went to office hours. I always went to class, and I always sat in the front row. And like I said, I went to UCLA, and some of the classes were huge. There were like 450 students. But to me, they were small because I was in the front row. No one was in front of me, and I asked questions, and I was in dialogue with my professors. And so through that, I got to know 2 professors very well, one of whom is, I think, still at UCLA, Sandra Hill, in gender studies. And gender studies was one of these majors that is also kind of, small. You get to know your professors. And Professor Brad Burns in Latin American Studies, who has since passed away. And both of them said, you really should go to graduate school. And I think I was a freshman, and it was probably my first quarter. And so I started thinking about it, although I was like, what is that? We hear about especially if you're first gen, you've heard about, medical school and law school, and that's about it. And so I started looking into it. And then I also took a class with Sonia Saldivar-Hall, who I believe is at UT Austin or UT San Antonio now. I took a Chicana feminist class where it just rocked my world. Anybody who's ever had Sonia Saldivar-Hall, she's just amazing. And, I had Sandra, who, notice I call her Sandra, who was, a white professor in gender studies, and we could call her Sandra. And then I had Sonia Saldivar-Hall, who we were supposed to call Professor Saldivar-Hall. And so she always had like a little bit of distance with us. And as I got to know her, I remember her talking about like the way that she felt she had to comport herself as a professor, as a Latina. She always dressed beautifully. She, had us use her title. There was just a certain way in which she was very professional, that she thought as a first gen Latina, as one of the first few Latina professors that we would meet, that she thought it was important to do, not just for us, but everybody she came in contact with. So I didn't really have these like kind of aha moments. I just always put myself in a place where I could talk to people, talk to professors, and talk to my colleagues, talk to my fellow undergraduates. I did this program, Minority Summer Research Exchange Program, put on by the Ford Mellon, where I went to Yale. And and the person who was our graduate student kind of mentee or mentor, his name was Jonathan Holloway. And a lot of the people didn't meet with Jonathan, but one of my other friends, Juan Mai Bush, who's now a professor at LMU, we would meet. I mean, we're such nerds, right? We're like, it's summer, sure, we'll go to your office hours, graduate student. And so we met with Jonathan. And this is the other thing that's really important. Graduate students are really important mentors for undergraduates. They're kind of like one of those rings in the ladder that help us all move forward. And Jonathan was always wonderful with us. Professor, he became a professor of African American Studies, became the dean of humanities or social sciences at Yale, president of Northwestern, and now is president of Rutgers. So, just always making sure I was connected to people and talking to people and learning and seeing ways to grow. I'm going to turn to the chat. Thank you for coming, Adrian. Adrian Adams asks, could you talk about an example when you felt like you had a slump in your career or felt stagnant and how you navigated that? This morning when I was trying to write first thing, Adrian, and again, I try to put myself in a position. So I'll give you like the small answer and the bigger answer. I have a bunch of tools now on writing, on doing things that are hard. And so I just break things down. I remember I get to choose what I do. And today I chose to write. I made it easy. I gave myself a time limit. And I reminded myself what the bigger picture was, that this little writing that I'm doing today, what I call kind of a little writing swatch, will turn into a story that I hope helps other people and helps people understand race and racism and how we can undo it in our society. I think a bigger slump or a bigger kind of obstacle was, I mentioned, I think about race relationally. When I first started, not a lot of people did that. They tended to look at things in terms of, African American studies, Asian American studies, Native American studies, Latino studies. And so my first book, Fit to be Citizens, which actually starts with a chapter on the Chinese in Los Angeles. That was the largest Asian group at the time. And if you look at some of their earliest surveys, demographic surveys, population surveys, the two categories they keep track of are white and Chinese, not Mexican, not Black, not Native American. And even though the Chinese population wasn't even that sizable, but they were kind of their racial other at the time. And so I argue that it creates a racial script, a way of thinking about race, that when Mexican immigration increases in the 1910s and 20s, there's policies, attitudes already set in place, even the way that the city is laid out and who can live where, so that Mexicans fit into that script a little bit more easily. And I had a lot of advice from people, publishers saying, it just makes it more complicated to think about race that way. Why don't you just cut out the Chinese, Japanese? Why don't you just deal with Mexicans and we'll market this as a Latino studies book? But I think you have to trust your gut. And I knew that was not the story I wanted to tell. I didn't think they were wrong. What I thought was missing then was I wasn't telling the story as effectively. So I got feedback. You always have to get feedback from people on your job, whether it's teaching or writing or whatever it may be. And I was able to then, make it into a book that, I'm glad to say is still being used 15 years later and was very useful to many during the pandemic as people were trying to understand the anti-Asian racism that we saw. Thank you. Daisy asked, who was your biggest inspiration during your graduate studies and how did they contribute to your understanding or navigation of academia? That is a good question, Daisy. I don't know if I can point to like one person. What I try to do, and it is funny that Judge Fusselman did that beautiful analogy of the 5-tool player. I get inspiration from everywhere I go. I get inspiration from I get inspiration. Yesterday in class, we're doing spatial, what are they called? Spatial story maps. And so the students have to deal with a new tool for, to present their work. We've been doing papers. They've done primary research. It's a class on what it means to be Mexican American. How did this category form? The title was put in place, I think, like in the 70s or 80s. So we're also showing how that category has changed over time. And they've written papers, but now they're doing a digital platform, story maps. And I wanted to make sure everybody understood how to use the technology, as well as had all their things in place, all their primary sources, their narrative in place for, as they finished up. And it was beautiful to see my students just with their original ideas that, this is an undergraduate class. So some of them are spatial thinkers. You can tell in how they're processing materials. One of them said, I'm a poli-sci major. I'm going to take a poli-sci angle on this. I'm like, yes, this is why we give leeway in this assignment for people to bring in their skills. One of the students said, I think we might need an extension on this because this is a whole new technology. She's, a freshman. It's a lot to stand up or, kind of raise your hand and ask a professor for this. And I could see when you're teaching, you feel the energy in the room. It's a beautiful thing to be back in the classroom. You could feel the energy and you could tell everybody was thinking the same thing. Also, it's hard. We're still in a pandemic. People are adjusting to being back. And so I was like, yeah, good for you. Use your voice. So for me as a graduate student, just reaching out and talking to people, going to talks. I remember one of the talks I went to was Professor Gabriela Arredondo. She's at UC Santa Cruz. She was a professor, I think, at University of Chicago at the time. And she gave a talk. She was the first graduate student I'd seen give a talk. It was through USC's, the center that Bill Devereaux runs on the center of California in the West. And somebody challenged her in the Q&A and she was so professional. She's like, well, I think your opinion is based on this. And I can tell you from the literature I've read this, and I can tell you from the research I've done that. And that moment has just always stayed with me, really believing in yourself, understanding those stories. Yeah, I think I'm a very kind of touchy-feely person. So I draw inspiration in when people stand in their own truth and speak with passion, and all those moments kind of create that collective inspiration for me. Before I turn to the chat again, does anybody in the room want to ask a question? There's no such thing as a free lunch. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, I will turn to Jelane's question. Thank you for coming, Jelane. Jelane asks, how have you learned to balance individual long-term work like research and writing with mentorship, teaching, and more outward-facing work? Oh my gosh, once you put it that way, it seems impossible. How can one balance that? That's a great question. So, I think one thing is seeing that balance is also kind of long-term. So there are times that I devote myself to research and writing, and that is something that I will do once the semester's over. Right now, I'll just be very concrete and maybe that'll help. So right now I am, I always make sure I start with a little writing in the morning. So I'm always touching it because I kind of think of it like as a stew on the stove, like when you make beans, you just keep that little simmer going, and there's stuff going on, it's changing, there's an alchemy, you may not see it, but it happens. And so I make sure I touch that a little bit, but I'm teaching a new class, and so I'm reading new works. I'm teaching works that I've already taught, but in a new framework, a new setting. My students are just wonderful. Shout out to American Studies and Ethnicity 373, Mexican American History, Mexican American Studies, who bring their own questions and ideas to the conversation that make me think about it differently. And it's not uncommon for me to answer their question, but then in the next class period say, I kept thinking about that, and come up with new information for them, or new perspective, or a new way into their question. So that's taking a little bit more time. And then in terms of, writing and mentorship, that's just always a block in my schedule. So that's just always part of it. It means that I do have to turn down talks sometimes. I accepted this talk, and then because Professor Sanchez, who runs the Mellon program, asked me to be part of a panel for Mellon students. And that, again, that is what matters to me, students, and making sure we're not the last ones as professors here. So I'm going to do that on Friday. And then I have a talk next week. But I asked that person, please don't send me any more questions until after Friday, right? Like I can only keep so many talks in my head. But that being said, that's not always about balance. I think that is also what inspires me. As you know, Jelaine, one of the things that happened when I came to USC 3 years ago is I found, students found me, and we now have this beautiful community of graduate students, and it's a big community and of graduate students that I'm officially on their committees. And so we do a mini retreat with the graduate students. I highly recommend it to professors and to graduate students to suggest to their professors, because then I'm not the only one mentoring. Students are also mentoring each other. And you as a first year student, you want to hear from someone who's more recently been through that experience. And so those students speak up and mentor. And then as a professor, I also have like the 40,000 foot view, and I can say, yes, but also make sure to do this. Or yes, let me underscore why that's important. So as my obligations grow, my strategies for bringing people into the mentoring and the teaching also grow. Adrienne Adams, who is one of the, the first ones who asked a question, and thank you for doing so. We met when Adrienne visited the program, but we also really bonded and got to know each other well when we both were students. I was a student in Andy Rotowski's digital humanities class in terms of mapping and GIS for USC. USC has wonderful digital resources and digital storytelling resources. And so, this is another way in which I get my work done, is making connections with people and finding new tools to tell these stories.
So Professor Molina, we're coming up on the hour. So I think we probably have time for one last question. And I think there's a Q&A function and a chat function. And so it's your pick. It's your pick. I think there's a variety of questions in there. Which one you'd like to close us out with? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I did not realize that, so thank you. I was like in the chat saying hi to everybody. Jelaine, how you doing? Okay, so one of them is boundaries between work and life. So I think I spoke to that a little bit. Well, actually, that might be the one. So an undergraduate, one of them is very quick. How can an undergraduate student connect with you if you're not taking a class? Come to office hours. What research are you currently conducting? I will direct you to my new book, A Place at the Nayarit, which was included in the intro, and it's on my webpage. And if you just Google A Place in the Nayarit, so if you're interested in food, cultural studies, cultural histories, how immigrants take back lands, really engage in the city. I hope you're interested in that book. And the last question then, how do you balance work and life? How do you recharge? Do you have a career mission statement? I know I don't. It's just like too much pressure. And so I'll just say, things like this, you carve out time to do it, but really connecting with people, knowing what's important. I just read this interview with Anna Duvernay, the director whose work inspires so many of us, and she talks about. She always makes sure she includes something fun in her work. So if she travels for work, she'll have drinks with a friend or dinner with a colleague, or might visit a museum. And I think I've kind of gotten to that stage where, as Judge Fusselman said at a conference, I'm very busy. But to me, if I'm connecting with former students like you, Alina, like Jorge, if I'm meeting in one of these mini retreats with my graduate students, if I'm talking to my students in class, if I'm learning by doing the digital humanities workshops, then that's fun. We're learning, we're growing, we're connecting. And, you know, these are all the things that make a difference to me, as well as the Dodgers. Thank you.
Great. All right, well, on behalf of the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life and the Levin Institute for the Humanities at Dornsife, as well as the Interfaith Council, we really appreciate you answering our call and invitation to share your story with us today. So thank you, Professor Molina, and thank you to all of our audience members online and here in the room. We look forward to seeing you next month when we highlight President Folt for our next What Matters to Me and Why. Thanks again, and see you around campus.
Thank you, everyone.